we don't have that, we have an hour or whatever. So when I was in rabbinical school,
And we are live here in
what is that?
Okay. Nothing. My phone came on. It's
Oh,
off.
okay.
Susan, can you mute everybody so we don't have outside noises, please?
I think most people are muted.
Okay.
Okay, that's okay. It's not that noisy. And I like to have your input. So when I was in rabbinical school, we spent just a little time studying Maimonides, and we studied different, he was such a brilliant man. He wrote so many things. I'm going to give you a little bit of his bio, but the one thing that blew my mind was his medical wisdom and how he lived from 1838 to 1204, and the things he was a doctor. The things that he knew medically were so brilliant and so ahead of his time that I wanted to share some of them. And he actually, which I didn't send you, but he has a diet that he talks about what you should eat for a long life and health. This is a medieval diet, but it's amazing how close it is to what our nutritionists say today. So I wanted to share that with you. But first of all, just to know who he was, he came from a prominent Jewish family, and he was born in Spain, Cordoba, Spain. And he became a rabbi and a doctor there at a very young age. But then a group of a certain sect of Muslims, this was during, before the Spanish Inquisition, before the return of the Christian rule. This is, in 1100s. So it was basically ruled by the Moors, the Arabs, and the Muslims. A certain group became very strict and started oppressing Jews and took away sort of the rights of Jews and Christians. And they were forcing conversions. So Maimonides and his family then escaped to Morocco, and he lived in Morocco for a while. And then this came to Morocco. So they say he went to the land of Israel for a short time and then ended up in Egypt. He lived in Egypt until he died, where he was a philosopher, a rabbi, and a doctor. And he was such a prominent doctor that he became the doctor of the caliph, the head of all of Egypt, the king, whatever they called him, the caliph of Egypt. So he was the royal physician, a Jew, which means it was a pretty, esteemed man. Now, his name, Maimonides, he wasn't called Maimonides. His name was Moshe ben Maimon, Moses, son of Maimon. And in Hebrew, if you say Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, the acronym is Rambam, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. And among, scholars in Orthodox, they call him the Rambam. Rambam is how he's referred to in Hebrew scholar studies. And then in the Greek, they called him Maimonides, but he was never known personally as Maimonides, but that was the name he got afterward in Latin and whatever, because he was studied by scholars for several centuries after he passed away. And besides writing this treatise that we're going to look at on health, he wrote an entire commentary on the Talmud called the Mishnah Torah, which means the second Torah, which was so mind-bogglingly brilliant. He went through the entire Talmud, and if you look at the Talmud, it's full of arguments. They pick a topic like when should you say the Shema, how long in the morning or at night, and then they'll argue for like 15 pages, and then they'll come to a decision. So the Rambam, Maimonides, went through the whole Talmud, and he just wrote the questions and the decisions. So you don't have to go through the whole discussion. He has the answers there. It's like an incredible summary of the whole Talmud. So that's the Mishnah Torah. And he also wrote the Guide to the Perplexed, was a philosophical treatise that is very complicated to understand. And he also wrote the 8 articles of faith, of what it means to be a Jew in medieval times. And he also wrote the very famous list of the 8 stages of charity, the lowest being you give charity to a person and they see you, you see them, him or her. The second one, like they don't see you, but you see them, but all the way down to the highest form is giving someone a job. So that he did all of that. And he also wrote this incredible thing called The Regimen of Health. And he wrote from his observations and his treatment of people, these suggestions for health. But beside we go into that, he also treated the son of the vizier of the caliph for depression and anxiety. He treated him and he wrote up these prescriptions and treatises for depression and anxiety. And so I wanted to start with what he said about that to begin with. So if you have the pages, we're going to look at them. But we're all going through stress and anxiety right now. I mean, I wake up anxious sometimes just because I read the newspaper and I just think, how is anybody going to avoid this virus? It just seems, I'm like anxious. So I'm looking at Maimonides. And he also, during his time, there were the Crusades. He was ransoming Jewish captives from the Crusades. It was a pretty stressful time. He had a run from 2 different countries. So he understood it, but he was running this for the prince, basically. And he said that you have to have and he also, can you imagine, said there's a connection between physical health and psychological health, that a healthy mind makes a healthy body. And if you're unsettled in your mind, which we know how stress can bring on things, it will make you ill. So he says, if emotional stress is maintained for a long period, one will definitely become ill, which we know stress, PTSD is a emotional disease that causes all kinds of physical ailments and mental ailments. Constant anxiety damages the body. This is incredible. Emotional experiences produce distinct changes in the body. Emotions also have an effect on the circulation of the blood and the functioning of one's organs. They affect the body and they are in turn affected by the constitution of the body. So I thought about like heart disease or heart attacks that are caused by emotion. You can get a heart attack from strong emotion. And he's talking about this in that time that he saw that this happened. And that it can affect, because when you think of the circulation, you think of the function of the heart. The physicians should think that every sick person has a constricted heart, while every healthy person has a broad state of consciousness. So he's talking about psychologically. What do you think he means by a constricted heart versus a broad state of consciousness? What do you think how that would be? What is that to your mind? What do you think?
Fear and tunnel vision.
Fear and tunnel vision. Okay.
They go together.
I like that. Any other ideas what that would be? Wait, Merle, and then Karen. Merle.
Well, I was going to say what Robert said, but also it doesn't just affect when you're having an emotional problem or we're freaked out by things that people are saying or doing, or the misinformation that we're getting or whatever. It affects other physical ailments too. It affects diabetes and blood sugar numbers and people with high blood pressure and stuff like that. So I think that a hardened heart, however you look at it, is that it affects everything in your body and your heart can't necessarily control it right.
I liked it. I think you're absolutely right. And it does say that he wrote, which I didn't have, he wrote and talked about diabetes, asthma, and what was the other ones he talked about? Hepatitis and pneumonia. He recognized them in that time. So you're absolutely right. Yes. Okay, Karen, you wanted to say something.
Well, I was saying that if the heart is constricted, the first thing I thought of is that the emotions are constricted. You're not letting in emotionally what's going on. You close off.
Exactly, and that can affect you physically.
Yeah.
Because we're all this stress. Okay, Talia, where were you? You had your hand up. There you are.
Yes. With a constricted heart or closed heart, I don't have the text in front of me.
They said every sick person has a constricted heart, while every healthy person has a broad state of consciousness.
So I think of spiritual ailment. Spiritual ailment, that it's like a spiritual emptiness, and that is typically like the lack of trust. to have a
Could be.
closed heart or something.
And when you have that, you get stomach issues, you get digestive issues. I mean, it's unbelievable. Okay. Therefore, the physician should remove all emotional activities that lead to anxiety. This way, the health of a patient is preserved. This principle takes precedence in the cure of any patient, especially if his illness is specific to this area, like depression. He mentions the word depression in 1100s. So he's saying that when you're anxious or stressed and it's affecting you physically, you have to remove the stressors, which means you have to calm down. We have all these suggestions. Now we're all stressed out. Take a walk, meditate, breathe. He's saying, so he's suggesting that remove the emotional activities, which I guess could be people too, or your job or whatever affecting you. And he's talking about this. You're not going to cure them physically until you deal with their emotional issues, which I find fascinating that he would be aware of that in this time. Okay. Okay, so another thing that he said was, okay, so this is his suggestion for how, he said, Maimonides, how to deal with the challenges of stress. So he says, contemplation alone reduces bad thoughts, anxiety, and distress. So he's saying, I thought it meant meditation, but I don't think so. I think he's saying, you got to self-examine the cause. Most thoughts that cause distress, sorrow, sadness, or grief occur from one of two things. So these are really modern thinking. Either one thinks of the past, like the loss of money or a beloved one. So either right now, this is like half the country, I would say. Either people are grieving the loss of a loved one, or they're freaked out about their income, about the economy or whatever, and it's causing a huge amount of stress. Or one thinks of something that may occur in the future, like a possible loss or injury, and one fears they're coming. Or you're worried about what's going to happen. Either you're freaked out about what's happened, or you're worried about what's going to happen. My daughter actually told me something she learned in a therapy session that I have shared before. Worrying is wishing for something you don't want.
Oh, that's wonderful.
You know?
I have another story about worry. Can I tell it?
Yes, please.
So I can't stand turbulence on the airplane. I really go crazy. And it was very turbulent. And I motioned for the flight attendant to come over. And she came over, she unbuckled her. She said, what's the matter? And I said, I'm very worried, And she said, well, worry is like sitting in a rocking chair. You feel like you're going somewhere, but you're not.
That's good too. Excellent. So do you think there are any other causes of distress, sorrow, sadness, grief, or any other cause of depression besides these two that Maimonides mentioned? Does anybody have any other ones they wanted to add to that? These two sort of cover them all. So he says, if you think about it, thinking about the past is of no benefit at all. In other words, he says, don't dwell on the past because you can't do anything about it. And there's no difference between a person who grieves over loss. Well, I don't know. And then he says, sorrow and grief, you can't do anything about it. And what does he say? Any anxiety that results from thoughts about what may happen are pointless because everything is possible. He has a very wide view. Everything is possible. And then he suggests trusting in God. He says that you should instead let the person replace anxiety with hope. And with this hope, it is possible that in fact, the opposite will happen. So, when you're a spiritual person, first of all, he's saying anything could happen. So to worry about one possible thing is useless. And also to have hope, which is I just saw an article. I get this thing. I highly recommend it. It's this email from Jewish Learning. And it's one of the questions was, is hope a Jewish thing? I mean, we are very big in the hope department. You know, the name of the national anthem of Israel is Hatikva, which means the hope. So Maimonides says instead, have hope in that things will work out, or have hope in God. I know that Holocaust survivors have said to me, they always said, as long as there's life, there's hope. And they always lived by that. As long as there's life, there's hope. So they always, you know, hoped for the best. And sometimes, I mean, they survived. These are the ones who are telling us the story, are the ones who made it. So obviously for them it worked. But we're talking about, you could be immobilized by fear and anxiety till you can't even get out of bed. We know that exists too. So Maimonides is giving you, he's telling you to worry about the past. There's nothing you can do about it. And to worry about the future, well, there are a million options. And for you to focus on one is also useless, and instead have hope. So I found that extremely, okay. But then, he also, it says here, Saladin was the caliph. His son also complained of constipation, depression, stress, and indigestion. He wrote him a prescription of herbs. And all of these herbs that he included in the prescription are herbs that we still use today. So he suggested lavender, borage oil, which is stabilizes the adrenals, rose hips extract, which is good for anxiety and fatigue, and lemon peel, which helps mental fatigue and mental clarity. So, and can help in depression. So he was also an herbalist and a psychologist at this time. Any questions or comments that you want to say about this before we continue? I mean, I'm blown away by him, actually.
I'm kind of curious, what do you do with the lemon peel?
I think he probably put all of, drink it, put it in, either inhale it or maybe put it in hot water and drink it. A hot water and lemon is really good for your digestion. It does calm you down. Talia?
Oh, the whole idea about the past and worrying about like things in the future. I've heard that expression. You can look at the past, but don't stare. So that way you can move forward.
Yeah, and you want to learn from the past, but to obsess. This is about, obsession, depression, anxiety, fear. I feel like is it comforting to know that people have been doing this, and that even in the Middle Ages, people were suffering from the same thing? Merle.
I find it really interesting that all those many years ago, that lavender, which I just discovered a few years ago, it helps, it helps me with dizziness. When my blood sugar is too high, or if my stomach is bothering me, I use lavender behind my ears, and I discovered it when we were all dizzy on a cruise years ago.
Wow.
It was like, who knew? I mean, people are running around selling essential oils. Little did we know until a few years ago that they really do work.
Yes, and lavender is very good for inhaling when you can't sleep. Also, it's relaxing. It helps you sleep. If you put some on your temple, some lavender oil, or near, so you can
good to
inhale.
know.
And actually, I have a spray that I got that's a lavender spray that you spray on your pillow, and it helps you sleep.
So lavender for me, I could asphyxiate. I had such a bad reaction to lavender, but I'm a huge proponent or advocate, I should say, of naturopathic remedies and essential oils. But lavender, for me, I like almost suffocate.
Okay,
like I need
so
to have crazy.
You have to be careful that you're not allergic.
Right.
So Sue, did you want to say something?
What he says is brilliant. I don't think there's any doubt. But the question is, if you're suffering from depression, or you're, just saying to somebody, well, worrying about it isn't going to fix it, that doesn't mean that somebody can stop
Right.
the worrying and stop the depression, which is, it's.
Of course. And if it's a biochemical thing, of course. And that's why he
This is
then,
what I had once. I had a biochem, my mother passed away and my entire endocrine system went crazy.
right.
And there was nothing I could do about it. I mean, they had to give me medication. And it's interesting that over time, the symptoms went away and I stopped taking the medication and I've never had it since.
Right, but what about, postpartum depression that they say?
Yeah.
That's also a thing. But I like that he said borage oil, which works to help stabilize the adrenals.
I didn't know about that.
I didn't either, but that's one of them. So you're right. He did say you sometimes need a prescription, and that's what they had in those years was herbs. Then he wrote in the Mishnah Torah, in the middle of all of his other stuff, he wrote chapter 4, which was a whole treatise now on the body and health, physical health. So that was mental health. This is physical health. And I love his introduction is, if you're not physically healthy, you can't really appreciate God, you can't worship, you can't behold the wonders of the world. So you have to keep your body strong because, as a very religious man, he also saw that one of our purposes is to serve God through good deeds, through the mitzvahs or whatever, which you can't do if you're physically ill. So it's kind of he saw it as a divine commandment to be physically healthy. And a blessing, I'm sure, and a big mitzvah to be a doctor who could help people. And I heard that he worked so hard because he worked for I remember this, that on Shabbat, he would lie on his couch exhausted, but people would still come in and he would talk to them and diagnose them. But he was lying on a sofa because he worked 7 days a week and he worked at night. And also, I forgot to mention this, originally he had a brother who was a merchant named David, and David supported him and the family with his trade. But David, merchants, you had to go on these long sea voyages, and he was on his way to India, and the ship sank and he drowned. So this was a huge grief to Maimonides, to Rambam, but also now he had to make more money to support the family. So he was also the head of the Jewish community in Cairo, writing, teaching, and being a doctor. So he was really draining himself. Okay, so here's his first thing, which is amazing. One should never eat unless hungry, nor drink unless thirsty. And this is a big one with him. You should never hold back if you have to go to the bathroom. He says, if you have to pee, you need to pee. If you have to defecate, one should tend to this immediately. He's very big on the bowels and the urination, and it's very important to cleanse your body. That is his number one halacha. You shouldn't overeat, and he talks a lot about overeating being bad for you, or drink unless you're thirsty. And he says, again, one should not eat until one's stomach, you shouldn't eat until you're totally full, but only until you're 3/4 full, a quarter of a way from full. Don't eat till you're full. And you shouldn't drink, he says, water during a meal, except maybe a little with wine. He likes wine, and we know how healthy wine is for the heart. He later talks about how the Muslims, forbid wine, but he thinks wine is very healthy for the body. And he talks about that, which I'll share with you in a minute. And he said, you should not eat if you have to go to the bathroom. Again, one should not eat until one has checked himself to make sure that one does not have to relieve yourself. So don't go to the bathroom when you need to, and don't eat if you have to go to the bathroom. Don't hold it. Go and do that, or your digestion's going to be ruined. Also, one should not eat until one has first walked to the point that the body has warmed. So he believes in exercise. You should go out and exercise every day. You need to warm your body, and better if one bathes in hot water after the exertion. So he says you should. So again, he's about hygiene. We're talking about a time when in some places people bathe once a month, once a year. Who knows? In France, that's why they invented perfume, because people stunk so much. And he's saying every time you exercise or you go walk in the morning, you need to bathe. So he's talking about hygiene. And the hygiene of Jews, well, you know, as we know, we have a blessing and we wash our hands before every meal. That was one of the reasons during the plague, the Black Plague, that people accused the Jews of being the poisoners. And why were they not dying the way other people were dying? Because they were cleaner. They didn't know, but this was like a ritual. So they were cleaner. They were washing their hands before every meal. And if you're bathing like this, I suggest that, you know, even a doctor would be cleaner. I don't even know if doctors wash their hands. We know that women, until like the 1900, a lot of them died from infection because the doctors didn't wash their hands when they were delivering babies. And women were getting this puerperal fever, this infection in their vagina and all the way up into their system from the dirty hands of the doctor. But if you're washing your hands every time you take a walk or you're taking a bath, you're going to be cleaner. Okay. He also says you should sleep for 8 hours a night. The night and day are 24 hours. It is sufficient to sleep for a third of this, 8 hours. So we know how now doctors are saying, I get Prevention Magazine. You need to sleep 8 hours, especially as you get older. And he's telling you now in 50s or 60s that you need to get 8 hours of sleep. And he also talks about you shouldn't sleep on your back or face down. Now this is interesting, I don't know, but on your side. And actually it says on your left side and at the end of the night on your right side. I've heard that it's healthier to sleep on your left side if you have high blood pressure.
Is it the heart?
What?
Is it the heart?
Yeah, they say it's healthier to sleep on your left side. I guess if you have high blood pressure or something. And it says one should not sleep soon after having eaten, but should wait about 3 or 4 hours. And you shouldn't take a nap, but that's, you know, him. I don't know how he did it without taking a nap. Okay. And then he talks about eating foods that help with your bowels, because he's very into this non-constipation thing, and not mixing foods. Now, there's a lot of thinking now about how you shouldn't mix some foods with other foods for digestion, and he's talking about this here. He says foods which excite the bowels are such as grapes, figs, berries, pears, and melons, and some cucumbers should be eaten before the meal. So there's this idea, what was this called? Like Fit for Life or something, was a book in the 80s about how you're supposed to eat certain things in order and not mix certain foods for digestion. And he's talking about this. And he also says, if you're going to eat like meat or eggs or chicken at one meal, you should eat the lighter food first, like eat the egg, then the chicken, then the meat. So don't mess up your digestion. So I guess it's working hard, then we're not working as hard or whatever. So he believed in that. And he said in the summer, you eat bland foods, and in the winter you eat spicier foods. And I think Chinese medicine also believes that idea, that you eat spicier foods because it's more, it generates more heat in your body in the winter, and in the summer you don't need it and you don't want to generate heat. Had anybody ever heard that about acupuncture or Chinese eating? Yeah, something like that. Okay, now this is unbelievable. There are some foods that are exceedingly bad and you should never eat them. Salted fish, old salted cheese, truffles, mushrooms, salted meat. We know, like, you know, they're saying that cold cuts and all these things that are salted, you're not supposed to eat. He's telling you not to eat them. Obviously, anything that smells bad, he talks about. And he says he doesn't think you should eat a lot of tree fruits. You know, he says you should only not eat a lot of fruit from the tree. I'm not sure, but he believes that figs and grapes and almonds are the best. Figs, grapes, and almonds. So we know almonds are really good for ourselves.
Aren't figs a tree fruit?
Yeah, but for some reason, these are okay. They are tree fruit, actually.
Okay.
I guess he's talking about apples and peaches, and I don't know why. We don't know what they were like where he lived also, what they were like or something, but that was his belief. Okay, now this, Yes, Roy.
I think the key word is excessively.
Yeah,
because
you're
it's
right.
like everything in moderation. It's tempting to eat those fruits because they taste good. And so you have maybe a tendency to overindulge. And so, I think for me, it's just the excessively is the sort of driving, the point of emphasis.
I think you're right. And I think especially in those times when being fat was a sign of wealth and even beauty and prosperity, and chubby women, Manoma, her husband or her father was well-to-do and could feed his women and whatever. To be thin was not considered beautiful or attractive. It was considered poor. For him to say, don't overeat, don't eat too much, don't eat excessively, was probably very odd advice or medical suggestion at that time. So halacha 12, I find amazing. Honey and wine are bad for children, but good for adults. I mean, I didn't even know when my daughter was little that I think I vaguely knew that you're not supposed to, you're not supposed to give anybody, babies or kids under 1, honey. It's very dangerous. Did you all know? You know that, right?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, you're not. Talia, did you know that?
Yes, I think it's because of being unpasteurized, and there's a lot of, it's just not, I don't know why. Maybe it was an allergic thing, but I just remember being told not to do it. And I thought it had to do with the fact that if it's pasteurized or like refined and clear, then it's, no different than Caro corn syrup. But if it's raw, then there's a lot of impurities in it.
I've heard that it was very dangerous to feed children before the age of 1 honey. Merle.
I remember when Sharon was little and the pediatrician told us no honey and no peanut butter. One, because of allergies, that those are highly allergic things, but also because they don't break down.
Right.
So that if they eat it like off a spoon, then they
can't
could
swallow.
actually clog their throat and they choke on it.
Oh. Well, I found that amazing. I mean, wine is bad for children. I guess people were giving their children wine because, they wouldn't tell you not to do it if most people were doing it. So I guess watered wine, watered wine. I mean, I know in England, no one drank water. They drank wine and water. They thought water was diseased or whatever. So, but then honey, I thought, and it's good for adults. And it is good.
The reason, I just looked it up, the reason why you don't give babies honey is it can cause infant botulism.
Oh
my God.
Oh, wow.
That is amazing. So he knew that. Don't give children. I mean, he said whatever age it was, but don't give it to them. And he also thought that you should always have he's really into the bowels. You should have a little diarrhea. You should always have fast bowels, better that you're digesting faster than slower. On the other hand, if you're constipated, he said for older people to drink hot water with honey, which is a remedy for a lot of things today. And for adults or younger people, it's like boiled vegetables and then drink the water sometimes from the boiled vegetables. Salty and seasoned with olive oil, fish brine, and pickled fish oil. Well, that would make me sick, but, or whatever. Okay, now this was like his key thing. The sages, so he's saying this is from the Talmud even. As a general rule, as long as one exercises and exerts himself well, doesn't eat to satiety, in other words, you don't eat till you're full, and is able to maintain properly loose bowels, he will not become sick, and his strength will continue to increase, even if he sometimes eats bad foods. So that's probably true for today. If you exercise and you don't stuff yourself and you can go to the bathroom on a regular basis, you're going to be healthy for a long time. And he's saying this was in the Talmud because he says the sages say it.
I'm not eating to the point that you're completely full. I read that when we eat, our body starts to produce serotonin, which makes us feel satiated. But there's a little time delay between the time you start eating and the time the serotonin kicks in. So even though at a moment you might still feel hungry, it's not that you need food, it's that your serotonin hasn't kicked in to say we're good, stop.
Right. But a lot of people eat for emotional reasons. They don't eat because they're hungry. They eat because they're depressed or anxious or nervous or bored, and
Yeah.
I think most people who have weight problems, they don't eat because they're hungry, or they don't feel hungry, but they feel a hunger that's probably emotional that they're trying to fill with food.
Thinking about it, serotonin is something that's used to fight depression. So maybe people, eat comfort food to get a big fat serotonin hit.
Absolutely. Comfort eating. It's a self-soothing mechanism to overeat. Absolutely. Okay. So now, but what he says in Halacha 15 is, overeating is like poison to the body and the cause of many illnesses. Most illnesses are caused by bad foods and by overeating, even if one overeats good foods. So, yeah, diabetes, heart disease, all this stuff he's saying, it's poison to the body. In the Middle Ages, when people were probably stuffing themselves and feeling that was like the ultimate. So he was a man of moderation, and he obviously felt that physical health, he feels physical health. He had such wisdom about physical health. Oh, he says, okay, any comments or questions? The way of the baths is to indulge there every 7 days. So he thinks you have to at least bathe once a week. And women, of course, went to the mikveh, which is kind of you had to take a shower or a bath before you could go in the mikveh. So we know women bathed at least once a month. But I guess people usually went before Shabbat or before holidays or whatever, that bathing was very important. And he says you should wash your hair, you should wash your head, but you shouldn't bathe after you just ate or when you're hungry. And you have to eat, just bathe in a certain time, and you don't go out with a wet head, don't get a chill. I mean, I don't even know if that's true. Is that still considered true, that you can't go out with a wet hair, or is not true anymore?
People say it is. I don't know whether it is or not.
But he's saying that, and don't stay too long in the bathhouse because you can get dehydrated, which is like going to the sauna or the steam. You're going to get dehydrated. And be sure you don't have to go to the bathroom. And one should be of a similar discernment. So you don't go to the bathhouse before or after eating, before or after having sex, before or after doing exercise. You have to wait a little bit. And before or after sleeping. This is what you have to concern yourself about doing it, having some time. I don't know why that happened. Hold on. Okay. Now he talks about sex being like how to preserve your semen. And I love that he quotes King Solomon, who says, what does he say? Do not give your strength to women. And a person who's obsessed in copulation ages rapidly, and your strength disappears, your eyes dim, you smell, your hair, eyebrows and eyelashes and the hair of your beard and everything gets thick and your teeth fall out. I don't think he had a great sex life. But he's very much about, not having, though it's interesting in the Talmud, I think in my Torah class, we looked at this, that the rabbis are very clear about how often you should have sex. A husband should have sex with his wife. And it talks about how, depending on your profession, how often you should have sex. If you're a scholar, you should have sex with your wife 3 times a week. Like if you're a camel driver, once every 2 weeks. And they have different levels for different professions. And they always say, don't be disgusting, be clean, and don't make your wife ask for it. If you see her looking at you in a certain way, and you need to satisfy her. So the rabbis were very much about yes, sex is important and you need to have a good sex life with your wife, your partner. And so I love the Talmud because they never leave anything to chance, like your opinion. Like, what do you think is a good sex life? They tell you this is what it is, depending. If you're a merchant, when you come home once a week and take a bath first and don't force her. So I'm not saying Maimonides thinks that. I think he's talking about people who are, he says, if one is obsessed with copulation, and it doesn't even say with your wife. So I guess people who went to prostitutes or whatever, which people did, but he's saying too much sex will destroy you. So that's his view.
Do you think?
Yeah.
Do you think that it was a strange form of maybe like not birth control, but like population and birth control? Because telling a scholar to do it more often, well, I guess a scholar wouldn't be necessarily more affluent than a camel driver. So I take that back. But I don't know. It just
this is the minimum, because if you're home and your wife is home all day, then you got to do it. If you're out on the road, they don't expect you to do it, but they're saying when you come home, you need to do it. But this idea that, I don't know, don't forget, this stuff that he wrote was not just for Jews. I mean, a lot of people read it. So one has to wonder what the sexual morality or life was like in medieval Egypt. You know, were women just objects and to be used any way they wanted? And, you know, obviously women had no rights. A wife had no rights. You know, you were property of your husband. Was it a way of protecting women? By saying, you know, if you do it too much, or you're going to die, you're going to fall apart, you're going to lose your vigor. So I'm not sure. He also says one should not copulate while standing or sitting, nor in a bathhouse. Now, when you have plans to go to the bathhouse, not on a day when you let blood, because he believed in, you know, leeches, not on a day when one starts or finishes a journey, or on the day before such days. So he's saying, you know, you have to be very relaxed, has to be a good time, you have to be in a good space to have sex. Not when you have, it's not an animal urge like anything else. And he says that, I guarantee anyone who does these things will not become sick through their whole life. You will, your body will be perfect and healthy unless you were born with some kind of an imperfection. Okay, so this is now fascinating about the community. This is real. He closes this with this, and we should talk about this for a minute. In places where there is no doctor, if there's no doctor, you should follow my advice if there's no doctor. But it is not permitted for a learned person to live in a community. And a learned person, I guess, is a rabbi, a scholar, or whatever, that does not have the following: a doctor, a bloodletter, a bathhouse, a toilet, naturally occurring water, such as a river or a spring, a synagogue, a children's teacher, a scribe, a warden of charity, and a court of law, which is empowered to inflict corporal punishment and jailing. So if you cannot live without these qualities, these amenities or these needs, I guess he doesn't consider that a decent society. And most Jewish small towns or shtetls would have, I never heard about having a bloodletter, but we know a doctor. He's saying you can't live in a town without a doctor, or a synagogue, yeah, but a teacher, and a scribe to write Torahs or whatever. Roy, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay.
So is the bloodletter the barber? Weren't barbers the ones that also did the leeching?
Possibly, and also they pulled teeth, I think. The
Right.
barbers did that as well. So yes, and a children's teacher, education was so important that starting in, well, he lived in 1100, starting in like the Talmud said, I think it was like 400 BCE, that you had to have schools for children because parents couldn't teach if fathers were too busy working. And the first Jewish day school was in 50 BCE, the first Jewish day school. And you also had to make it free. We're talking free school for children in Jewish communities from that time on. And so by the time Maimonides, was alive, it's like, it's unheard of. You have to have a school. It's not a society, a decent or civilized society. Or a doctor, which, well, let's think about it. So these would be the main professions in a Jewish town. A doctor, a bloodletter, a bathhouse attendant, people who had the bathhouse, and a teacher and a scribe, a charity provider, a warden of charity. So what's a warden of charity, do you think? Anybody have any idea what a warden of charity would be?
Well, maybe like social services. Jews have always been taught to give to the poor. So it would be someone maybe controlling the giving and the donations, and maybe finding housing or clothes or food for the poor.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you did go around collecting and making sure. Did anyone else want to say anything? And then, and a court of law. So there had to be like lawyers, judges, or juries, and we're talking in a time, I just don't know what the rest of society was like at that time. I mean, was it as sophisticated, do we think? I mean, probably in Spain it was, where he came from. It was probably very sophisticated, and he knew a lot of doctors and Arab and Jewish poets and doctors and writers, and all knew each other. So I think he may have been bringing that culture from Spain, which was a very high culture, very advanced in the world, when he took it to Egypt and when he gave it to the Jewish people. So these are his things. And then he had a diet. So I wanted to share this diet with you. He says, this is a diet that everyone should have for the continuation of health. And the first thing he says, whole wheat bread with bran. You have to have the bran, and it has to be the real bread. He said that he said all that's made from wheat except this bread is no good. So he even said matzah, I guess you can eat it on Pesach, but don't eat it the rest of the year. Noodles, porridge, dough that's fried like a pancake, and bread that is kneaded in olive oil, or any white bread. Bread is bad. He's saying white bread is bad and it has no nutrition. So that's the first thing he said. The second thing he said is that lamb is the healthiest meat, but grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, he says. Lamb that is like out in the pasture, free and eating grass, is healthy. So that's what he says is healthy. And he says, otherwise it's no good. He said, chicken is better than beef, which we know. This is amazing. Okay. Don't eat a lot of dairy. Don't eat cheese. Cheese is no good. I mean, I guess people did, but don't eat cheese. But he says fresh milk is good, but not sour cream or sour milk or anything. And the best milk is the thinnest, which he says is goat's milk. So basically skim milk, low-fat milk, low-fat dairy. So whole grain, whole wheat bread, grass-fed beef and chicken, and skim or low-fat dairy are good. And he says cheese is very bad and a heavy nutrient, except for cheese that is white cheese and light in fat. So, light cheese is what? Goat's cheese, a little cottage cheese, I don't know, cream. I mean, okay. And he says, eat a little butter, clarified butter is better. So he's talking about, okay. He says, bees, honey is good, but not for the young, again. And it's very good for those of a hot temperament. So he thinks it has a soothing quality, honey, calms you down or whatever. And we also know honey is considered kind of a natural antibiotic, that if you have like an infected throat or a sore throat or whatever, taking hot water and honey or whatever. He doesn't like fish, which is interesting. He says most fish are bad, but the fish that are small of body, white, and frangible of flesh, sweet to the taste, from the sea or running waters like mullet are not bad, but don't eat a lot of fish. So I don't know what that's about, because we think fish is very healthy. Yes, Roy.
I'm guessing the small fish might be like sardines or anchovies.
Yes, which are considered
Or
good.
oils.
That are more salty.
Well, yeah, but he says no, they should be fresh. Small fish, sweet of taste. You know, little fish, not the big fish. So that was his thing. Okay. And then he says the best, what?
A little trout.
Little trout, yeah, whatever. But you know how there's the huge tuna, the huge
Right.
salmon or whatever. He's saying no.
Okay.
Well, they do say that it's like exponential in terms of the toxicity. So if you have little fish, let's say mercury, or I don't know what they had then, but any things that are not good, as the bigger fish eat the smaller fish, it's contains a lot more bad stuff.
So that's amazing that he's,
Yeah.
somebody else have something? Okay. So then he says, the best of all nutrients is that which is prohibited in Islam, wine. He thinks wine is great. And we know now wine is good for the heart. Isn't that funny? I mean, that's only come out in how long? In the last 20 years that wine is good for the heart? And he says, that's my phone. He says it's quick to be digested, and it flushes out the pores and the urine and the sweat, and it has what did he say? It nourishes you, and it's good and abundant and delicious. And he likes wine. He thinks wine is healthy for you, but we know it's healthy because it helps your heart. But he felt that wine probably, I don't know. He said drink a little wine, not a lot. Okay, now you have to tell me, how are these vegetables reviewed today? Because I don't know. These vegetables are generally bad for all people. Garlic, onion, leek, radish, cabbage, and eggplant. They are hard to digest unless prepared correctly, is what he's saying. So is that right, Susan?
Well, some give you gas. And I know a person who is allergic to onions. I don't get it with garlic, except it's odorous, and I've known people who eat too much garlic, and then the next day or later that day, their body has an odor.
Yeah.
With it. So
yeah, but garlic has an anti-inflammatory factor.
I know that.
It's actually supposed to be good for you.
Right.
It absolutely is. And generally those are good for you, but I'm saying that maybe he knew some people who had garlic and smelled, and some of them are gaseous.
Yeah, cabbage for sure is very hard to digest.
Yeah.
And people say eggplant, that's a nightshade vegetable, can give you arthritis.
Yes, like potatoes, I guess, too.
Yes, and tomatoes.
Yeah, he didn't talk
the
about that.
nightshade ones, and eggplant.
He says the cucumber and the gourd are less harmful. And again, the gourd are like squash. And as for the yellow melon, if you eat it at the beginning of the day on an empty stomach, and there is no evil humor present if you don't have any stomach aches, then it will be digested well, and it will help you. It'll cleanse the veins and empty what is in them. He thinks that melon is a cleansing thing, which I believe is true about melon, especially like watermelon really cleanses you. And he doesn't really love tree fruit, as I told you, and he likes figs and grapes. He says figs and grapes are like princes to the rest of fruits. And then he said that, you know, he some of this is from like Greek philosophers. And then The best of fruits are grapes and figs, and the worst are peach and apricot. But dried fruits such as currants, dry figs, and the kernels of dried almonds and pistachio are not bad. It is good to partake of them after the meal, especially the currants and the pistachio, for they are beneficial to the liver. In the health of the liver lies our livelihood. It is good to take a few sweets after the meal so that stomach retains the meal and digests it. I don't know if that's true, but it's interesting that he knows about the liver being so important in terms of cleansing everything. So this is the brilliance of Maimonides. Do we have any questions or comments about it? I thought I would share it with you because I just can't believe how, you know, his vision, his understanding, and not just in the physical sense also, but, you know, religious and philosophical and spiritual. He only lived to be 69. And they said that's because he worked so hard and he traveled a lot trying to advocate for the Jewish people. That is a normal lifespan, but he should have lived longer.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you may have mentioned this in the beginning, but was he trained as a physician, or is
Yes,
he really a
yes.
philosopher? Or?
Yes. I think a philosopher, he studied on his own and he became an ordained rabbi, but yes, he studied medicine, but his observations were so much more advanced than so many other doctors, you know, of his time, that his writings were studied in the 15th and 16th centuries by medical schools in Europe because of his, you know, understanding and, you know, his comprehension of the human body and the psyche. So
You know what he died from?
they don't know. They just say that exhaustion, probably heart. They don't say. They don't know. I guess they didn't write that down.
It wasn't from constipation. I can guarantee that.
It wasn't from constipation or too much sex. Probably not.
It's amazing because there's a book called Back to Eden that I read when I went to college my freshman year, and I came back and I was like, don't eat white flour, don't eat this. And it's like everything he said. And I'm like, wait, but my mom was like a Hebrew scholar, right? Like she studied, and I don't know, but they just like wrote me off as like a crazy hippie, but he sounds like a little bit like a hippie. So that's
He's a visionary. He saw the results. You know, if he knew about diabetes, I'm sure he realized maybe that's why he said, don't eat so many fruits. You know what I mean? And just
sugar,
because of the sugar. And though the dried fruits are higher in sugar, but I mean, he wasn't completely right, but certainly his observations about grass-fed beef and low-fat dairy and whole grain bread are still things we've only heard in the last 20 years, 30 years. You know, I was raised on white bread. Everybody was raised on white bread. And here's
but
my
also
fortified.
The white rice was considered more pure. Like that was a big thing in Asia, was that the white rice was because it took more effort to get it white, it was considered a higher class of food. And so even the poor people were like, oh, but then they found that people eating white rice didn't get the nutrients, and the people that ate the brown rice that were typically poorer got the nutrients they needed from that. But it's so interesting that the mindset of white being pure, you know, white clean, that he had a different view, which I think is amazing.
And white flour, bread of white flour was the bread of the rich. You know, the brown bread was the bread of the poor. And he was saying, yeah, well, that's the good bread, people, and the white, but we all know that. And even when we read Jewish stories about, oh, the challah and the white bread on the Shabbat, because the rest of the week we only ate brown bread, and how beautiful it was, delicious. So I guess once a week is okay. But now you can even get whole wheat challah.
A number of his comments were then picked up by a pioneer in nutrition here in the United States, Adele Davis. I don't know who they're.
Oh, Adele Davis, yeah.
And her books, of which I read, and my mother lived by them, taught a lot of that. Brown bread was one thing because you get the wheat germ. In fact, she was a big proponent of wheat germ.
But did she credit Maimonides?
I don't think so.
Oh.
I don't think so, unfortunately. But she picked up a lot of his his ideas, and the grass-fed beef. Or anyway, I was just astounded that it was all here with him
Right.
before the modern or the 20th century craze.
It is not just the 20th, it's like the 12th. So it's so
No,
many-
but Adele Davis was in the 20s.
Oh, yeah, I know.
The-
Yeah.
The craze
exactly.
then, and white bread was everybody bit, where everywhere people were eating Wonder Bread, and it was a wonder that people were still healthy eating that. And Adele Davis came out very strongly against that, and for the dairy products too, that he mentioned. So
And even eating in a certain order, which is sort of still a lot of nutritionists are.
Aaron, I just lost the sound on my computer.
Who's that?
Merle, but I can hear her.
We hear you.
We hear you.
You have to unmute yourself. Yeah, I see you're muted.
All right, well, Merle, you're
Yeah,
muted.
I'll just say something, that you reminded me of not drinking water with a meal.
Yes.
My grandfather, who was quite educated with his Jewish knowledge, never drank water with the meals. And I always did. And he always pointed it out to me, always kindly recommended that I not drink water during the meals. And I just wonder,
Yeah, I drank it too, but he does say you can drink a little watered wine with your meal.
Well, we also, that wine was no problem, although my grandfather also ate shrimp. So he always kept some odd habits from his Orthodox background, but no water, but shrimp was okay.
All right. Well, I want to wish you a great week and thank you. I thought this was really interesting and I wanted to share it with you. And if we want to eat like Maimonides, we probably will be healthier. There's no candy or cookies or any of that in there.
Oh, boo-hoo.
None of his stuff there. So, yes.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone. Shabbat shalom.
Bye. Shabbat